A baby rhino is left behind because poachers took its mother. It's alone, grieving, and unsure how to survive. This is not a rare story. A rhino is killed approximately every 22 hours, purely for its horn to sell on the black market. Welcome to GoodViral, where we interview the people and organizations doing the footwork to solve big problems in our world today. In this episode, we speak with Simon Jones, founder and CEO of Helping Rhinos, about the powerful and personal fight to save one of Earth's most ancient species. We dive into the challenges of rhino protection and rehabilitation, the critical work collaborating with anti-poaching militant teams like the women-led Black Mambas, and how Helping Rhinos partners with local communities to turn conservation into economic opportunity, and how Helping Rhinos partners with local communities to turn conservation into ethical economic opportunity. Simon also shares why international awareness and cultural understanding are key to stopping the demand for rhino horn on the black market, and how education can change the future of the species. This story isn't just about wildlife. It's about global responsibility, local leadership, and what it means to step up when the world looks away. This is GoodViral, and welcome to the conversation.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of GoodViral podcast. And we've got Simon here with Helping Rhinos. And this is the thing, and I've been thinking about this a lot. And so I've kind of got these burning questions, and they're kind of basic. And I think a lot of people are really want to know the same things to get us started. So if you could, Simon, thanks again for coming and for joining us. And really what I'd like to, I think most people would really like to understand a little bit better is sort of what is the plight of the rhino today? What's really going on? And what are the things that are being done and what can be done? And so besides just knowing that it's the endangered species list, and sort of that's really all I know about it. And so can you share with us what's really happening out there?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thanks very much for having me on the podcast. It's a great honor to be here, and looking forward to our chat. What is the plight of the rhino? So that's a short question with could be a hugely long answer. I guess the thing that everybody knows is that what you've got, the biggest threat to rhinos is poaching. So rhinos are being poached, and in the current poaching crisis that really took hold in 2008, to be honest, is when it really started to get hit off. Then we've lost, literally thousands and thousands of rhinos to poaching in that period of time. Just last week, the South African government released the poaching statistics for 2024, which showed that we lost 420 rhinos in South Africa alone to poaching. That was down from 499 the year before, but there was that doesn't tell the whole story, because actually we've seen a huge increase in poaching in the last 2 or 3 months, the biggest spike in poaching since before the COVID pandemic. So that threat is huge and does threaten the rhino with extinction, to be honest, in our lifetime. If you think even 420, there's 365 days in a year, so that's more than one rhino a day is being killed on average by poachers.
And the motivation on the part of the poachers is it the horn, or is there?
So they're poached for their horn and for their horn alone. And the horn is made of keratin, which is the same substance as our hair and our fingernails. So people often get confused with an elephant's tusk, which is ivory. It's a tooth, essentially, whereas rhino horn is compressed hair. It's not a bone. And just like our hair and our fingernails, it grows back. If you cut it off above the growth plates, it will grow back. So they're poached for the horn, which is used in traditional medicines in the Far East, China and Vietnam, kind of the two of the biggest countries that the horn is exported to. And that alone is threatening this animal that's been around in some form or other, from before the dinosaurs, with extinction in our lifetime, which is just, I find personally, an incredible statistic.
Absolutely.
How can we let that happen on our watch when this animal has survived everything that's gone before it in tens of millions of years? And it's just down to human greed, unfortunately. As I said, there's all sorts of beliefs of what the horn can do for you in that traditional medicinal, anything from curing cancer to a hangover to a common cold. But in the same way as chewing your own fingernails makes no difference then taking rhino horn. So that is even more frustration. If it actually was doing some good, that you could perhaps understand it a little bit more and we find ways to work around that. But the fact is it doesn't do any good. And yet still, if you went back to the real height of poaching in 2014, when we lost 1,200 rhinos in a year in South Africa alone, then, back then, rhino horn was the most expensive commodity on the planet in terms of it was only you couldn't buy on the black market. It's illegal to trade in rhino horn. It's illegal to export rhino horn internationally out of Africa. But but back then it was more expensive on the black market to buy than gold or platinum or heroin, cocaine was for nothing more than compressed hair, which is just incredible. It has come down a little bit since then. Whereas back then it was being sold for about $65,000 to $100,000 per kilogram. Now we're looking about sort of $18,000 to $19,000 per kilogram, which is still an incredible amount for something that, as I said, is compressed hair. So that's poaching. That's the biggest sort of known threat. It gets the biggest headlines. It's not the only threat, however. I would argue that an even bigger long-term threat to rhino is lack of habitat and lack of space for them to live freely in. I've talked a lot about poaching in South Africa, and that's South Africa's home to about 70% of the world's rhinos. But if you look at somewhere like Kenya, for example, which is the country with the third largest national population of rhinos, then they've not lost any rhinos to poaching, or very few rhinos to poaching, I should say, in the last 6 or 7 years. We work very closely with the Orphaned Conservancy in Laikipia. They've not lost any rhinos in 6 or 7 years. But just about every sanctuary where rhinos are or conservancy where rhinos are in the country is now over the ecological carrying capacity, meaning that actually the land can't really sustain the number of rhinos. And then what you start to see is them, males coming into contact more often than you would expect them to. You end up with fights. You end up with more, rhinos killing each other. So we find that in Kenya as well. While we've still, poaching, can't lose sight of poaching. As I said, in South Africa, we're having the biggest spike since 2019, just over the last 2 or 3 months. But actually lack of space is going to, even if you solve poaching, lack of space is going to be a massive problem, and we have to find a way to overcome that.
Just in terms of habitat, is it pretty much the reserves that they're able to live on, or is there also a sort of free area that's not populated by people that's available for them to live on, are we pretty much down to just where
you're into reserves? Yeah, reserves really now is where they are, and for a few reasons. One is, as the human population grows and expands its footprint on the land, having wild roaming animals such as rhinos, which would be a threat to people, is that you've got to manage that human wildlife conflict element. At the same time, you've got the security from poaching. So while I said Kenya haven't had any, or very few poaching incidents over the last few years, that's not to say the threat's not there. So you've got to manage that security. So you do that as well. So, so our aim is looking at, there is quite a bit of land that is degraded habitat, if you like. So how do we restore that habitat? And then how can we, because as you rightly say, when you reserves, and to paint a picture, reserves typically is an area that has a fence around its borders. Now, we're not talking about sort of zoo type fences. We're talking about huge areas that, animals can roam freely in, but there is a border to that. So how can we create wildlife corridors or drop fences even between different reserves? So it's a very complicated situation, but it's one that we have to find solutions to and we have to overcome.
Yeah, I've always looked at the rhino as basically the wildlife. Well, I guess it's the first, but it's the wildlife version of the tank, right? And so to imagine having communities next to animals, which are basically, tanks, would be, quite an interesting conversation of how do you, build a life together or habitat that are close to each other. That would be interesting.
It can be done. You can have that sort of wildlife and people living harmoniously, but you have to find a way where that wildlife, even if they're still in fenced reserves and we've dropped some internal fences or you've created these wildlife corridors, there's still a way to do that. But then it's as much about how do those local communities benefit from the wildlife being there, and that isn't always the case. So again, we have to find solutions to that as well, so that those local people see financial benefit and benefits to their way of life and their livelihoods to wildlife and conservation being there, so it becomes harmonious rather than in conflicts. And unfortunately, there's too many instances where if you create that conflict and a competition between the human and the wildlife, then there's only going to be one winner, and it won't ever be the wildlife. So we have to find a way where the wildlife can benefit the people as well, and then the people have a vested interest in protecting the wildlife. Because while we can sit here internationally and do all we can, as helping rhinos to help rhinos, ultimately we have to have the local people taking ownership and accountability and responsibility for protecting their natural heritage and their wildlife.
That makes total sense. And, when it comes to the poaching, that's probably one of the things that are most talked about when it comes to rhino endangerment. And I was sitting here and you were talking about all of the poaching aspects. And I was sitting and going, if I were a poacher and I was looking to make, as you said, one time it was $80,000 for a horn, or for a kilogram of a horn, I would look at that rhino, which, like I said, is kind of like a tank, and go, how can I get that horn from that tank? I guess the best way would be to kill it, so that rather than a tranquilizer, which would be hard to access, I imagine, on the street. So my priority would be to make sure that the rhino doesn't get me and I could get the horn. And then my next thought was, if I were a poacher, I would want to try and control the market value. So I would want to make sure that rhino didn't regrow the horn as well. So it seems like killing the rhino for poachers is, in a sick way, kind of like their priority in a way. Can you comment a bit on that? Because if it can regrow, it would be almost like you could farm them, right? But that's not what's happening. So could you just kind of comment a little bit on the reasons why people are poaching as opposed to, having a good job and not risking getting hurt by a rhino as well?
Yeah, so I guess you've got to understand the environment, the culture where, that we're talking about. We're talking about very, very poor countries. There's a lot of very poor communities. And if you're sitting in the US and the UK, you might say, okay, well, I'll go and find a job. That isn't always easy to go find a job in the areas of Africa that we're talking about here. So, and actually it is worth pointing out that, while the horn might sell on the black market for, as we said, it is hyped for $65,000 per kilogram. Now we're looking, 18, 19,000. The poacher is not getting anywhere near that amount. The poacher is just a tiny cog in this whole wheel. So illegal wildlife trade, of which rhino horn makes up a big chunk of, is the fourth largest illicit trade in the world, behind human trafficking, drugs trafficking, and arms trafficking. Then you get illegal wildlife trade, and those same syndicates and criminal bodies that are running drugs trades and such like are also running the illegal wildlife trade. So it's those already very wealthy people not sitting on the ground in Africa risking their lives tracking down rhino are the ones making all the money. The poachers on the ground, really making a very small amount in comparison. But a very small amount to us is a very big amount to them, potentially. Where they could go, and there's always numbers put out there. You could earn, anywhere between a year and 10 years salary for going and poaching a rhino horn and bringing back rhino horn. But that's their incentive. I mean, you point around the incentive then to make sure the horn doesn't grow back because you control that. I mean, that's an element of that, I guess, in, from a syndicate potential, syndicate possibilities in terms of the people running that organization. They obviously want to keep that value falsely high. I think you could do that anyway because, the rhino population is in decline. So the population is declining anyway. There's always a story that's put out there. Somebody in Asia was hoping that they would one day have the last rhino horn from the very last rhino, because imagine how much money that would be worth at that point. So you do have to understand that sort of the economics, I suppose, that are at play behind it. And we have to consider all of that when we're coming up with, what's the anti-poaching strategy and how do we combat that? The same with, you talked about, could just farm rhino horns. Well, there are places where we do cut them. In fact, through most of South Africa now, nearly all rhinos have had their horn. We go through a dehorning process where you bring a vet in and you cut the rhino off above a certain point. And then it will grow back and has about a 4-year growth cycle, but you have to trim it every 2 years because otherwise, the horn has grown back quite a bit. But more recently, we've seen a real surge in poaching of rhinos that have already been dehorned because there's still quite a stump left on the rhinos when you dehorn it. And as I said, it grows back relatively quickly. So, we've seen that. So as I said, in the last 2 or 3 months, we've seen in Kruger National Park in South Africa, 39 rhinos poached, all of them dehorned, and 25 in the Gqeberha and Mfolozi Reserve in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, which is the largest single population of rhinos. So there is quite it is complex, and there is no one size fits all solution. The dehorning has really slowed down the poaching in South Africa over the last few years. I think there's a real risk now that we've dehorned so many rhino that you're not moving the problem from one to the other. Now there's nowhere to go. So now we're seeing this spike in poaching of already dehorned rhino. There's an argument that says the poaching syndicates now switch to volume of horn rather than numbers of horn. So therefore, to get the volume of horn, you need to kill more rhino than if it had one big horn on its nose. So dehorning worked, and to a certain extent is still working, but it's time limited, and it really needs to be just buying us time while we find longer term solutions in terms of security and groundbreaking new type of tracking devices, for example, things that give us early warning signs. And there's still no substitute for intel, knowing what's going on in the communities, and again getting the communities on board, which is where the poachers are coming from, and having them see other value in the wildlife other than what they can get out of it from just poaching.
We're taking a moment to see if you're feeling inspired by this conversation, and your heart, is it stirring, asking the question, how can I help? Well, you're not alone. You can be part of the solution. Visit helpingrhinos.org to get involved today. You can find all web and social media links for Helping Rhinos in the description from wherever you're listening or watching this podcast episode. Whether it's donating, adopting a baby rhino, spreading awareness, or simply learning more, your action matters. Helping Rhinos is doing powerful work on the ground to protect these incredible animals alongside its environment and human neighbors. And they can't do it without global support. Together, we can turn the tide on rhinos and their overall habitat. Now, back to the conversation with Simon.
So you mentioned before, or just now even, getting the communities, the people that are living there involved. Yeah. So I'm supposing that tourism might be one avenue there, that people going to visit and see rhinos. Is that the case? And the other would be, I suppose, or I'm thinking what the possibilities are. So maybe you can share about what they really are, but maybe it's just the protection of the animals, for example, being in anti-poaching groups, or I suppose they're like military services. So what are the ways to get the people that live there involved in the saving and preserving of these animals? Yeah.
So again, I mean, the ways you highlighted are definitely, two of the top ways. So, in what are traditional safari destinations. So tourism does provide a lot of employment. A lot of the lodges will have a commitment to, in excess of 90% of employees are from the local communities, so that you're making that connection between tourism and the wildlife and improving livelihoods. If the wildlife's not there, there's no ecotourism. If there's no ecotourism, there's a big chunk of jobs disappears as well. So that definitely helps. Getting on a plane and going on safari keeps that industry alive, and that definitely does help, as I said, with the local community engagement and giving back to the communities. There's other elements as well. I mean, you mentioned about the anti-poaching. So yes, that works. We work with the Black Mambas, among other anti-poaching units. So the Black Mambas is the first all-female anti-poaching unit in the world operating in the greater Kruger National Park area. And that employs, 36 women from local communities. Now, at the time when they were formed sort of 12 years ago, there was probably, it was the biggest, and still is, but was definitely the biggest underused resource in terms of women from local communities. So taking those women and training them, as you said, in a military style to become frontline anti-poaching agents, then that helps with employment. But you have to be realistic. The size of the population of those communities. If you're only taking 36 women out now, okay, each one of those women has got families that, having that level of job will really help them, caring for their families and providing for their families. But it's still a tiny percentage. So it's important that we do that, but that we take people from the local communities into that role. In the Eastern Cape in South Africa, we funded last year putting 11 cadets through and to now got jobs as anti-poaching rangers across the region. But again, that's a relatively small number if you look at the population size. So what we really got to do is look at how do we find other ways of giving back that isn't necessarily direct employment. So, for example, we talked about a lack of habitat. We've got examples where, we've worked with communities to relocate some of their villages that allows that space to become wildlife space. And then we pay effectively a rent to the local communities for that space. So the community as a whole is receiving financial input from wildlife conservation. Even that in itself is controversial because you don't want to be seen to be forcing communities to pick up their village and move from where it is. So, you have to be very careful when you work with the chiefs and the elders of the local communities to make sure that, everyone's on the same page. And that can take a long time. It can take many years. And another element then to working with the communities is we actually built 2 now schools or preschools, and we're in the process of a third, which will open later this year. So again, that gives you the opportunity to provide conservation education alongside more standard, sort of curriculum topics as well. Not only that so that gives you the opportunity to teach at a young age about wildlife conservation. Some of our programs we work with, again, the Bush Babies is the education outreach arm of the Black Mambas. We go out to 11 different primary schools and we run conservation education lessons. We also do, sort of more general teaching as well, but we go in and we paint the classrooms, make them a better learning experience. And then the best performing students over the course of the year, we take into camps within the reserve. So, maybe often for the first time in their lives, they actually get to see these wildlife firsthand. So that makes a difference. And then you're starting at an early age as well. And the other advantage of these education centers is that many parents, because they've got young children, don't have the opportunity to go and look for employment because they've got to look after the kids. So if you're giving the kids in school from 8 o'clock till 2 o'clock, that gives a window for the parents to go and seek employment. That means that, that again, they're improving their livelihoods. You also got a centre that can run as a community centre, outside of school hours as well. And the other thing that we do is obviously the kids are getting 2 meals a day and drinks that often they weren't getting that food. So, so you're reducing that level of hunger within very young children as well. So again, as I said, it's such a complicated web, but you've got to bring it all together because you can't focus on just one part of it. You've got to understand how it all links together.
I think you mentioned, that was fantastic, by the way. Thank you.
Yes.
But I think in there you said with educating the children, you called it the Bush Babies. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think that's the best name ever. I was like, that's so cute. Which kind of gets me with thinking with kids, generally kids usually enjoy being around other animals, at least from what I've observed. And so, I was looking at your website and I saw that there's multiple, ways that you help with rhinos. And one of them was with an orphanage or many orphanages. And in there, it talked about having orphanages for young or baby rhinos because their mothers either passed away or abandoned or whatever may have happened with them. So you can talk a little bit about that because I think I also saw on your website, it takes years to raise a rhino. I think we're used to seeing animals that are born and able to kind of live rather independently. But a rhino, it takes years of rearing. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So we work alongside Zululand Rhino Orphanage, which is on the borders of that, what is the current epicenter of poaching. So to give you an idea that we, 3 years ago, we released a number of orphans back to the wild. We just had one. We're now at a point from a security perspective where we don't actually share how many rhinos are there because it's gone up significantly. So, we don't want it to be a target. But it is vitally important. I mean, we use the term "every rhino counts" quite a lot, and and there's many examples, but every orphan shows that really every rhino counts, and most of them are there because they've been through a traumatic experience, mainly that their mums have been poached. We found calves that have come in. They've been often sat with their dead mother's carcass for several days, depending on how quickly they've been found. There was one example we got where actually the mum had been poached and then the likes of hyenas had come in and started to eat the carcass of the mother. And then we found this calf inside the mother trying to keep warm, So there's all sorts of really examples of how important it is to try and save these animals. And then to your question, it's about a 3 to 4 year rehabilitation process. So you would look to release them back to 3 or 4 years. When they're 3 or 4 years old, we put them back out into the wild. But the process of bringing them in, and it depends how old they are. I mean, I think the youngest we've had has been 1 day old. We've had several in at 2 or 3 days old. Sometimes they're a month old. I think the oldest we've ever brought in have been more like 10 months old. So they're getting close to when they would be leaving their mother. But if you take those little ones, those little ones, they're very tactile. They're permanently, in a natural world, would be permanently sort of having contact with their mother and running around and just having that interaction. So suddenly they find themselves in an environment where they haven't got that, but they need that. And the only people that can give that is the humans, and they kind of associate humans now with the killing of their mother. So it takes can be quite a difficult process to really calm them down and bring them and get them to trust the carers and the people who are with them. And, when they come in at that young, they've got to be fed. People often look at social media and look at the posts of people looking after the baby rhino orphans and say it's the best job in the world. And there's certainly elements of it that might be the best job in the world. But when you get an orphan in, you sleep very little for weeks. They've got to be fed every 2 hours, 24 hours a day. And of course, we have to rotate a little bit, but you can't have a big pool of people because they've got to build up that trust with their carers. Sometimes they'll have to sleep in with them and get them to the calf to really understand and just talk to them, soothe them, and and bring them around and calm them down. Often when they come in, we'll put earplugs in. So if you see a new orphan coming in, and there's videos of it on our website, you'll find we put earplugs in and then sort of bandages around the earplugs, and we put a blindfold on just because dulling those senses really helps calm them. So gradually you'll take the earplugs out, you'll take the blindfold off, and you've got to get them to start to learn to take milk from a bottle. And that can take days sometimes as well. So, you always, each animal has, of course, its own personality and it's different. And some take it very quickly and some will take days to do that. So, and then we have to start breaking that bond with the human carer, because what the last thing you want is, the goal of every single orphan that we rescue is to release it back into the wild. What you don't want is that orphan to start to become so comfortable with humans that when it's released back into the wild, it'll walk up to every human that it sees, because one human might be a poacher. You want it to be running away from humans, not running to them. So we need to break that bond. So now we've got more orphans in our facility. That's actually easier to create bonds very quickly with other rhinos. When you have very few, you end up, and you'll see, again, there's lots of footage online of this. You'll see that often we use goats or sheep to try and have another animal to build to build that sort of bond with. So that means that you can, at the right time, start to withdraw. What you really want is the rhinos in the end just coming up for their feed and then going back and being rhinos and just coming back up for their milk bottles and such like. So again, it's a complicated and stressful process. I mean, any wildlife rehabilitation is difficult. It can be the most rewarding thing, but of course you don't save all of them. So when you lose one, it's one of the most difficult things that you have to deal with.
Absolutely.
I kind of want to just quickly make a nice little shout out to you guys, because all of this is a lot of amazing work. And I can imagine it can be emotionally taxing. Not only are you seeing activity of the worst parts of humanity, or parts of it, and then you also build such emotional bond, I imagine, with, baby rhinos at these orphanages. And so there's a lot of emotions at play, not only for the rhinos and the orphans, but also for the humans. And so I just kind of want to give a big shout out and thank you for taking those loads on.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. As you know, I'm not on the ground every day as much as I would love to be, but I'm not on the ground every day. So the guys on the ground, the carers at the orphanage, you said, they build those emotional attachments, and you become, as people do with it, their pets at home, you build that emotional attachment when that animal is completely reliant on you, and you know that its survival depends on you doing your job properly, essentially. So there's a lot of pressure, and sometimes it becomes too much. There have been a lot of people who we've seen suffering with, PTSD to a certain extent, because it's a lot to deal with, and it can be very intense. And sometimes you do need to get away from it, because nobody can cope with that level of intensity ongoing, day in, day out. So we've learned as well over the years, as we've, unfortunately have more and more orphans that we've had to care for. We have to learn how to care for our people as well, and, make sure that mentally that they are doing okay, because we can't have everybody burning out to the level that no one can do the job anymore, because that's not good for the people, but it's also not good for the rhinos either, because they need those people. So, it's not just anyone that can rock up and start looking after a baby rhino orphan. You've got to understand and, have a degree of knowledge around, how do you read the signs, what drugs might you need to give them at what points, et cetera, et cetera.
If you've made it this far, you know GoodViral is all about spotlighting people and organizations who are actually making a difference, like Charity Water, Gorilla Doctors, Rainforest Action Network, and so much more. To keep doing that, we'd love your support. Become a GoodViral member at goodviral.org and help us grow this mission. Starting in August, members will get early access to episodes, exclusive behind-the-scenes content with our guests, deeper dives into articles, and abilities to join us live during the interviews to ask your own questions in the chat. If you believe in the power of stories to inspire action, come be part of it. Join us at goodviral.org/memberships. Our motto always has been and always will be, when good goes viral, the world gets better. Thank you for being part of the conversation.
So I believe that you guys have been around for about 12 or 13 years, right, as an organization. And it sounds like you're just trying about everything that you think might actually try to help the problem. And I was wondering about, maybe it's a completely impossible task, but I was wondering about education as a possibility in Asia, for example, trying to educate people that basically, hey, like you explained to us, this is just hair or fingernails, basically. This is not a magical quality. And I suppose that, of course, it's, you have, when there's an opportunity for a tremendous amount of money, and as you said, that the people that are perhaps dealing with all of this are morally ambiguous, involved in maybe some other horrible things as well, that obviously it's really just at that point about money. But of course, the demand from the people that are seeking these products. So has there been any ways that you know of to sort of educate the public in the markets where they're looking for this product, or is that even a viable possibility?
Yeah, and it's a good point, and it is a viable possibility. There are two sides to there's two sides to rhino conservation: there's protection and prevention. And from a Helping Rhinos perspective, we've got more down the protection side because of where we felt we could have the biggest impact and the biggest influence. That said, the prevention side, if you sort the prevention side out and as you say, you stop the demand, then the poaching goes away. And so that is a way. And there is quite a lot of work being done in Asia on that education. I think you started the next generations, and I think you see already that there is positive impacts in there. And and I talked about the price in horn has come down from $65,000 to $18,000. So we see some progress. Why? So then the next question, the logical question is, why is Helping Rhinos not more active and more focused on that education in Asia than we are? Why are we focusing more on the protection side? And the simple answer is that I don't believe we are we're UK headquartered. We've got offices in the US and in the Netherlands. I don't believe that us going out to China and Vietnam and giving talks on rhinos and rhino poaching is the best way to get that education done. I think it has to come from within and it has to come from internally. Otherwise, I'm just another Westerner going and talking to people in Asia and telling them how they should live their lives. And I've not grown up in that culture. I understand to a degree that culture, but I don't understand it like if you've grown up and lived there. So I think that for me is why we're not active. We have funded some local organizations to deliver some elements of education. And I think as the world becomes smaller and travel becomes more accessible and financial wealth of some of these Asian countries increases, then, you find more people from Asia who are able to travel and see rhinos in their natural habitat in Africa. And we shouldn't forget that Asia do have 3 species of their own of rhino as well. So stopping the demand is important. But you've got to remember that there were 2 elements of demand for rhino horn, the traditional medicine, and then there was the status symbol element of it, which has become less so over the last 5 or 6 years, but still is there to a degree. As I said, alluded to before, when it was the most expensive commodity in the world, that having a status symbol, we would see people, wealthy businessmen, offering rhino horn to their potential clients, not because they wanted to offer the rhino horn, they just wanted them to know that they could. The sort of Western analogy I use quite a lot is, if you've got a Ferrari, you might offer someone a lift in your Ferrari. You don't really want to give them a lift in your Ferrari. You just want them to know you've got one and you can give them a lift. And it's that type of thing. And, and the good news is that becomes a fashion thing then, and fashion comes and goes. And you've seen that change with rhino horn a little bit. But the traditional medicine side of it has been here for thousands and thousands of years. And you are not going to change that with a click of a finger. There's an argument that says you can't necessarily change that at all. And I think we have to be realistic of what our expectations are. People always talk to me about stopping rhino poaching, and of course that's what we want to do. But the reality is our first goal has to be to reduce it to a level where the population is in growth and not in decline. So in other words, we might still be losing too many to poaching, and one rhino lost to poaching is one too many. But if the birth rate is higher than the loss rate, then at least the population is in positive and not in decline. So that's our first goal. And I think then that if you think about what our goals are in that perspective and that context, then it helps you work out what you need to do best in terms of demand reduction in Asia. And I think it is getting to the next generation, seeing that over a number of years start to, that demand for rhino horn and other wildlife parts start to decrease. But as I said, it's been there for thousands and thousands of years, and we're not going to change that overnight. And we also have to understand culturally they're very different. They're very hierarchical, typically within their culture. So even if a teenager doesn't want to take rhino horn, if their grandparent tells them you must take rhino horn because you've got a cold, they will take it because they've been told by their grandparents to do it and the elders. So again, it's understanding all of that sort of cultural differences. So, sorry, that's a very long-winded answer to your question of why we don't work there. But that for me, that's why I say I think we should support local organizations, because I think they've got a much better chance of getting the message across in the right way because they are from the culture, they understand the culture. And that's only addressing poaching. When I talk about protection, we talk about anti-poaching, but as I mentioned, habitat loss is also a big area as well. So even if you stop poaching tomorrow, rhinos are still a huge threat, along with many, many other species in terms of habitat. So we've got to work on that at the same time.
Right. Right.
Real quickly, as we kind of wrap up our episode here, you mentioned the birth rate. And if I remembered correctly, larger animals just take longer to grow babies. And so I'm kind of curious, how long, in a sense, is the incubation for a baby rhino?
Yeah, so for a white rhino, it's 16 months, 15 months for a black rhino. So, it's very interesting because we all get very excited when we see a baby rhino. As you say, so birthing cycle with gestation is 16 months. So if you take that and then they're going to take probably 2 to 3 years before they would give birth to the next calf. So you're looking at a 3 to 5 year birthing cycle. And they give birth to one baby at a time. So one rhino gives birth to one baby every 3 to 5 years. If that rhino gets poached, that birthing cycle, you've missed that birthing cycle because it's been poached and it's not gone into help, with the gene pool and the population growth in the future. So now you're looking at 6 to 10 years for one calf to be added, or one rhino to be added to that population. So that's why we get excited when we see a baby rhino. It's why we're devastated when we lose one, because it's not, dare I say, it's not like a lion who, has a 3 month gestation period and gives birth to anywhere between 4 and 8 cubs at a time. You can repeat that and they can repeat that. If they lose their cubs, they'll give birth to another 4 or 8, over potentially over another, that could happen 2 or 3 times a year, whereas rhinos, that isn't the case. So, yeah, unfortunately, evolution has given them lots of drawbacks to help themselves. So we really owe it to them to do everything we can to let them get on with life. And that's the thing, when you look at these animals and they're out grazing on the plains, they really, although we know they're dangerous animals, but they come across as being so peaceful, and they don't know the threats that are there for them. So,
right.
we have to do what we can to try and protect them, especially when most of those threats are down to us in the first place.
Now, the complexity of this, it's really much more profound than what I had anticipated. And so I imagine that, well, you've got your work cut out for you, but for our listeners, obviously going to your website and learning there. But I want to ask you directly. So, we've got people that are learning, getting new information, learning about you, learning about the what's going on for the rhinos, and what can people do? So somebody's for the first time, you mentioned ecotourism, going to visit. Obviously, sounds like an amazing experience for anybody. But what are the things that you recommend that people do to support, whether be it donation or a particular kind of effort, or what is it that you recommend for people to be able to support the efforts that you're doing?
Yeah. So the first thing, go onto our website. If you go to the Helping Rhinos website for a start, there's all sorts of different sections on there that shows, it educates you about rhinos and the threats to rhinos. There's the donation section. We run the adoption program, so you can adopt a rhino orphan that's there as well. All of that helps with the financial support. Everything we've spoken about, unfortunately, comes at a huge cost in today's world. So everybody has the key thing. This might be, the problem might be on the plains of Africa or in, where the Asian populations are, but actually it's an international problem. It's an internationally created problem, and therefore it has to be an internationally solved problem. And so everybody has a part to play. But I understand we're also living in very difficult times financially at the moment, and not everybody has spare resources to be able to try and help us. So, but what you can do is hopefully share the word. I still come across so many people, and I guess I'm so immersed in this over the last 13 years or so that I still find it incredible that people don't know that rhinos are even being poached. So educate yourselves a little bit around what the problem is and what the cause is. And then the biggest thing is just tell other people, because you might not be able to help and support financially, but someone might be able to, and they might really want to if they knew what the problem was. But it's getting the word out, and and that's why again, thank you for having me onto your podcast, because the more people we can share the word to about, in our case, rhinos, but rhinos really are the figurehead for us. By protecting rhinos, we're protecting every other species that shares their habitat as well. And I often get asked that, why rhinos? Well, if you're protecting rhinos as the most threatened with poaching animal within those areas, you're therefore making that whole area safe for the elephants, for the lions, for the leopards, for the dung beetles, and everything else and in between. So visit the website. If you've learned something watching this podcast, then fantastic. And tell someone else about it. Either give someone the link so someone else to watch the podcast, or just say, oh, by the way, did you know? And then that can open up all sorts of conversations, and then send them back to us at Helping Rhinos. And, I have conversations most days with people and it is a lot about money, because as I said, unfortunately, money makes the world go round, and everything comes at a cost. But there's other elements as well that we can talk about. So, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And there's other ways as well. There's a really great film has been made called The Last Ranger. In fact, there's several rhino films, but the most recent one we're looking on is a film called The Last Ranger. It's a short film, and it was nominated for an Oscar in the live short film category. And that's an amazing achievement. And this film is actually it's a fictional film, but it's based on a real life event, which was a poaching of a rhino, which was the same poaching incident that really made me set up Helping Rhinos in the first place. So we are putting on a screen. We've got a London-based screening, but also an online screening on the 21st of June. And I'm sure your audience is very international, so forgive me talking pounds, but for just £10 you can buy a ticket to the whole event. We have Q&As with the filmmakers. We actually have one of the Black Mambas on stage with us as well, and you get to watch the film. And it only costs £10. You get a fun 90 minutes to 2 hours, and you're doing your bit to help as well. So there's always things like that isn't just about making a donation. Many ways that you can help.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, for being with us and being on the podcast and doing what you do, and having the team behind you as well to be on the ground, and when you're not on the ground, but to be on the ground and helping not only the rhinos, but the communities and the environment. It's all connected, as you said. And so we really appreciate your efforts, for sure.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks again.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you. And obviously the work is important, but as you say, the most important thing is that one way or another that we all sort of contribute. And as you say, on our watch, right? So that's what this is all about. And it's not just about rhinos, like you said, it's about so many other animals. So again, thank you from my part as well. Yes.
Cool. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the GoodViral podcast and being part of the conversation. If you are inspired by this episode, go to our website at goodviral.org, where you can find resources and listings from the episode to continue good efforts.
Like, comment, and share this episode to any or all of your social media channels. It's really easy to take a small action, and maybe you'll inspire a big result.
When good goes viral, the world gets better.